Hello to all you junior seminar students. Welcome back. Today's lecture is focused on process and concept as it relates specifically to designers, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But first, I had a few things I wanted to talk about in terms of synthesis, in terms of the last lecture. Some things that I think maybe I didn't make quite as clear as I should have. And part of that is because the way these lectures are designed, I've always designed them to be as much about raising questions and getting people to think and trying to figure out what the answers are. But this semester, because I'm recording the videos, but I'm not teaching the class, I've tried to make a little bit more effort of leaving some open areas for people to think, but also trying to, after a while, trying to provide clarity and to make things a little bit more concrete and explicit and clear. So with that in mind, some things I wanted to just make sure that are lessons that you got from the synthesis lecture. Number one, the idea that all culture, all of human culture, for the whole history of human culture, all culture is a product of ongoing synthesis, ongoing recycling and recombining of different cultural ideas, and that there is nothing wholly new, and yet also every idea is at least partially new, and that sometimes the most interesting ideas are the ones that are very clearly synthetic, because sometimes the things are very clearly synthetic that feel like they are combinations of things that are quite familiar to us. Is that one of their benefits is that they're both wholly new and exciting and also quite familiar simultaneously. Two, because of that, every one of you, every artist, every person who's not an artist, we all have influences, lots of things. Every TV show we watched when we were 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, and every song we've listened to, and every artist we followed, all of that is part of who we are as persons, as well as who we are as artists. Um, 3, therefore, you should aim to be a good consumer of culture, and what that means as a good consumer of culture will be discussed more and more throughout the class. But one of the main things I would say is that you should aim to not limit your culture. You should be willing um, to listen to or to experience culture beyond your comfort zone, and that you should always be thinking and critically thinking about the culture that you consume. 4, you should be finding synthesis in your education. If nowhere else as an art student, you should be finding synthesis in how everything that you're learning in school is all about combining to make you a better person. Education should be transformative. And it should not simply just be, well, I learned this skill here and I learned that skill there. The sum of all that should be way more, the whole should be more than the sum of the parts, right? And so that when you're done, your education should transform you into a much more thoughtful and mature person. And this is especially true about your art education. Every art class should not just be about gaining certain skills, learning programs, or learning how to use a ruler and an X-Acto knife together. It should also be about getting you to rethink your whole ideas about art and about production and about seeing. The learning of art should transform the way you see the world and transform the way you think. That's the nature of it. Um, and 6, um, that that some people will will definitely be finding some synthesis in the development of their work and in their aesthetics. This is especially true of the studio students. And I think one of the things that I want to emphasize, though, is that this is not necessarily true of everyone. Some people just begin this process by the end of their 4-year BFA process, and some people. Some people are far along kind of early on and kind of having a sense of a coherent aesthetic to their artwork. All right, and then secondly, I wanted to emphasize some lessons from that lecture that are specific for young designers, since this particular lecture is much more addressed to the design students anyway. So one thing to remember: every design project, right, every assignment you get is an opportunity and a search for synthesis, because you have to do research, you have to do mind mapping, brainstorming, thumbnails, and every time you're pulling together both everything that you learned about the client, everything in your research, everything, all the different ideas, and then hopefully the best idea that you find is somewhat um, a product of that synthesis, and then also a product of a distillation from that synthesis. Two, that also design students should be finding synthesis in their education, in their whole education, the whole education at college, but also in their art education and specifically in their design education. Your design education should not be just learning set skills. It should be, with every set skill there also should be a transformation about how you think about design, and each of them should build towards this idea of you more and more thinking like a designer. When you start, you are an art student who's studying graphic design. When you graduate, you should be a graphic designer, and being a graphic designer is a transformation. It's a different thing. It's a different way of thinking. Okay, three, some junior, senior design students will find some kind of synthesis in their thesis project, right? And this kind of relates to this idea, or in a thesis project, relates to the idea of what does a good senior show look like for a graphic design student. And for some, this means that they kind of, as they're getting a sense of a certain thing of synthesis and what things they're interested in, it gives them an idea of what kind of design problem or design project they want to explore. And in discussion with faculty, they come up with kind of a thesis project that they could do, a body of work, maybe 5 pieces that are all focused on this one thing. But this is not required. Some junior and senior design students find synthesis in their studio work, right? And especially sometimes in bringing their design thinking to their studio work or to a body of work in the studio. We see this a lot with graphic design students bringing a very graphic design aesthetic to screen printing. And some in the reverse, where they find synthesis in the influence of their studio work into their design work, such as some who really get excited about more second levels of photo, like they're taking, let's say, digital photo, and they really more and more want to bring some of the aesthetics of what they've developed in their photography work into graphic design pieces, and that is also happens. But once again, these types of synthesis are not required for a graphic design student, right? And then lastly, 8, a point I didn't really make, but I should have made, I think, in the last lecture, which is that the type of synthesis that we're asking studio students to start to search for and start to find in their senior year, which is kind of a synthesis of aesthetic, like having a sense of who they are as aesthetic problem creators, problem solvers, decision makers. That's something that is not as easy to expect for a young designer. In fact, that kind of thing is something more that you happen to see when you look at a designer's whole career, rather than something you would expect a graphic designer to know when they were graduating from a BFA program. And some of that has to do with the field, how graphic design is much more focused on projects that are outside the artist, right? That they're about thinking about others, they're about thinking about client, thinking about market, and that they come from outside, and the graphic design student needs to solve those problems individually and to a certain degree without much sense of voice, because if they have too much of a sense of voice, then they wind up solving all those problems the same, and that could be a problem. So there we go. Synthesis. That might be the last we talk about synthesis. Maybe not. So how am I doing? Oh, wow. We just started the lecture and I'm almost done. Okay, this is probably going to be a 3-parter. I will get back to you with part 2 in just a little bit.